So one of the things about being a good parent is making sure that your kids' toys work properly, right? You got to inspect them. You got to play with them all the time. You just got to be a good parent and do that due diligence. And one of the things I found with Mega Blocks is the foundation is essential for the tower. Right? If you don't have a good foundation, the tower is not going to be substantial by any means. Now, I say that recognizing for most kids, the point of the tower is not to build a really tall and awesome one. The point of the tower is to knock it over. Right? So for them, the foundation is not really that of an issue. So I get that. But with the actual blocks we have, I have found that this is the best foundation that I have been able to create. It's a 6x6 rows, and it allows the blocks, the towers, to be built high, to do all sorts of different things that can be fun. Now, I recognize I don't have an engineering degree by any means. There's probably better ways that people can come up with creating this, but this is something that I have perfected over the last 5 years, I guess, of how can I make a foundation that is as substantial as possible, because it means nothing to my kids if the foundation is really where it needs to be. But the reality is our foundation is important. It's crucial for us in order to make sure that our life is going the direction that we want it to go. We do recognize that there are times where our lives take some detours, have some bumps in the road, and so we have to rebuild or restore whatever that looks like. And the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah are about rebuilding, about what happens when God's people have to come back and restore. Because remember in Ezra chapter 1, King Cyrus of Persia gave God's people the permission and essentially the commission to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And we find later in Ezra 1 of all the precious items that they took with them, somewhere between 30 and 45,000 pieces of valuable items they took back with them to begin restoring the temple. And then Ezra chapter 2 talks about the people that actually left Persia and went to Jerusalem, those who left exile and were restored in Jerusalem. And there were 50,000 people. Now, to us, that genealogical record probably doesn't mean much. But it was really important for a couple of reasons. And first, it was important for the priests. Because in order for someone to be a priest and have all the rights and responsibilities and privileges afforded to priests, he had to connect himself back to Aaron. So the genealogical record was very important in order for that priest to have the legitimate ministry. Otherwise, he wasn't allowed to go into the temple as he otherwise would be. The other reason the genealogical record was important is for the people to claim their land. If you remember when God's people left Egypt in slavery and went to the promised land, God gave them the land. It was their inheritance, and it was divided between tribes and clans and families. And so for order then to come back to Jerusalem, to the promised land area, and reclaim this inheritance, they had to be able to show their family history, show how that was actually their family, to make sure that they could come and be restored. And one of the things I find is that you and me, we are like the priest who couldn't connect his lineage back to Aaron. We're like the Israelite who couldn't necessarily track his genealogical record back to the people of Israel. That's who we are. I'm not saying we're Jew or Gentiles, that's my point. The point is that we can't achieve vindication on our own. I can't save myself. I can't restore myself. I can't build my life up myself. But this is where Jesus comes in. This is where Jesus comes in and he restores, he saves, he vindicates, he redeems. And that's what we long for. So today I'm talking about our foundation. But one of the things I find is we can say, hey, our foundation is Jesus. Woo! Let's go eat lunch. I think there's more to it that we need to evaluate. We would agree our foundation is in Jesus. Most reasonable people, even if they're not a follower of Jesus, would say that, a Christian's foundation should be in Jesus. Even if they're not a Christian, they would probably say, well, if you're going to follow Jesus, that should be who you follow. Right? Pretty easy stuff to recognize. to conclude. But sometimes we may say our foundation is right, but the rest of our life doesn't really look like it should. So I'm going to build a tower here. And this is, you get bored after building so many towers. You got to kind of mix it up a little bit. So this is one of the towers that I was able to build that allowed me to exercise some of my creativity, I guess. And as I think about this tower and all the towers that I've built over the years, I recognize that not all towers are created equal. Some towers are more fun to just knock down. Some are fun to sit back and admire. But each tower has the ability to bring joy to our lives and so forth and whatnot and all that kind of good stuff. But kind of have a mess in here. I had to build some stuff ahead of time to make sure that I had all the pieces I needed. So I gotta get organized here. Hopefully, oh no, I just ruined a tower. Oh, sad day. Sad day. Okay. Anyway, we'll get it figured out. It won't be that big of a deal. And this is a really cool tower. So I'll just have to build it pretty makeshift real quick. So anyway, as I'm building this tower, I'm recognizing that there are certain ways that we can build our lives that look cool but may not be the best way to actually go about building our lives. And it allows us to make compromises that we wouldn't necessarily make otherwise. Because what happened when God's people returned, when they returned to Jerusalem, the first thing they did was they settled in their homes. Right, we find in Ezra chapter 3, they go, they settle, they essentially unpack. But then after a while, they assembled together in Jerusalem. They assembled together, and Ezra 3 actually says they assembled together with a unified purpose. And that purpose was to reconstruct the temple. Now this looks a little janky, but that's okay. So anyway, so the purpose was to reconstruct the temple. And as I said, we can build things differently. And I found this just to be a fun way to build a tower, and it's really easy to knock over, right? It's just basically on these single blocks that allow it to stand and function and whatnot, but it's real easy to knock over. So they go and they want to rebuild the temple because they want to offer sacrifices to the Lord as accorded in the law of Moses. And even though they were afraid of the local residents, they rebuilt the temple on its old site. And they began offering sacrifices to the Lord each morning and evening. Then after that, they celebrated the Feast of Tabernacles as prescribed in the law, sacrificing the number of burnt offerings on the specified day for each day of the festival. They also offered the regular burnt offerings and the offerings required for the new moon celebrations and the annual festivals as prescribed by the Lord. The people also gave voluntary offerings to the Lord 15 days before the festival of the tabernacle began. The priests had begun to sacrifice the burnt offerings to the Lord. This was even before they began to lay the foundation of the temple. So again, they regroup. They leave Persia. They make the journey to Jerusalem, to the Promised Land area, and they unpack, and then they regroup. They come back together. Now, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is the setting, the mentality of what was actually happening. Because they unpacked, made temporary type shelters, and then they came to Jerusalem. It's not like they set their home security system when they left, right? They left their tent, their makeshift shelter, whatever it was, and went to Jerusalem. And they couldn't trust anybody that was left. Anybody who didn't go to Jerusalem, because there were two groups of people that wouldn't have gone. There were those who had nothing to do with God, just foreigners or whatnot, and would not have necessarily respected the Jews, and so they couldn't necessarily be trusted. The other group of people were those who should have gone to Jerusalem but weren't. Those who claimed to follow God but were saying, it's not worth it to us. And you can't trust them. So they were taking risks by doing that. And the first thing they did is when they got to Jerusalem is they rebuilt the altar. Rebuilt this place that was a dedicated place of offering, of sacrifice, of worship to God. They restored it. So what we find is that their first priority was their spiritual health, was making sure that they got things in order, that they allowed God to speak into them. Because one of the things we recognize, and we would at least say this, whether we believe it is sometimes different, that, we don't need a building to worship God. Right? We don't need an actual address and a 501c3 organization in order to function as the people of God. We don't. And they recognize this. They didn't need the temple. They just needed a place that they designated, a place that said, this is for God, a place we are going to worship Him. But they're in a very dangerous position. They're in a position that's not exactly easy. Remember, in Ezra chapter 1, they had the blessing and commission of King Cyrus to go do this. But that didn't mean the occupied powers were in favor of it. That the people that were ruling Jerusalem, the people that were in charge there, they watched God's people with a very suspicious eye. But I would say that God's work, His purposes in this world rise and fall on leadership. And I'm not talking about competency. I'm talking about courage, about faith, about obedience, and that type of leadership to make sure that we sacrifice for Him. Because God's people in this moment, they were afraid. They were scared for their lives. And I don't think they were acting in spite of their fear. Instead, I would say they were acting because of their fear. And there's a big difference there. When we act in spite of our fear, normally it's we hide, we cower, we lash out, we do things we otherwise wouldn't. But when we act because of our fear, we're saying, regardless of what's coming, I've got to do this. I've got to take a stand. I've got to do what is right, even though it's terrifying. See, they were afraid. They were afraid of their lives, afraid of their livelihood, afraid of their ability to function because of the occupied powers in this place. But they said, we're afraid, and the only solution is to go to God. The only solution is to seek God, is to worship God, and to go to Him. It wasn't about protecting themselves. It wasn't about making sure that they could survive. It was about putting God in the proper place. And so after they did that, after they built the altar, after they began these sacrifices, they started celebrating the festivals. And the one that was listed as the Festival of the Tabernacle, or Festival of Booths, or Shelters. There's different names for that. And what this is, if you remember, God's people were enslaved in Egypt. And God brought them out, and they wandered the desert before they entered the Promised Land. For 40 years, they were in the desert. And while they were in the desert, they would have these temporary shelters that they would construct. And so that's where we get the festival of the shelters or booths. These booths that were just temporary places for them to dwell. But what it did is this festival celebrated God's provision for God's people in the desert. That God brought water. God brought food. God brought shelter in a desolate place, in a place that offered nothing good for the people. God was able to provide. And it was a way for them to remember what God had done, to remind them that God is capable of doing anything in the future. But a lot of times, if we're honest, it's real easy for our celebrations to either exclude God or kind of say, hey, God, you can be part of it. Instead of God being the focal part. Instead of God being the core reason for why we do things. Probably the most obvious time for us to examine this is Christmas. Is God just part of our Christmas celebration, or is God the Christmas celebration? Right? So it's a matter of making sure we recognize, we have these festivals, we have these religious ceremonies or celebrations. We have to make sure that we keep them in the correct spot. Because here's the reality. You will spiritually fail if your foundation is frail. You won't survive. You won't be able to thrive in any meaningful way. We've got to have the foundation. But the foundation produces things that we can see. And so I have another tower here. Normally I would put it on this foundation, but we're going to leave that one on its own foundation. And boom, right? nice, sturdy-looking tower, one that is going to take a little bit more effort to knock down, one that's probably not really exciting, right? This one's more interesting to look at. You probably would agree with that. I can't say I'm a decorator or a real creative individual, but I can tell that this is pretty boxy, pretty basic. It's just a tower that goes straight up and it has a few little extra things on the top, and that's it. But our foundation should produce things. And so we look at these different towers, and maybe you like this tower better, maybe you like this tower better. That's not the point I'm trying to convey here. But we need to make sure we recognize our foundation is in Jesus, but what is that producing in our lives? Because our foundation is important, and there's many things in our lives where foundation comes into play. And a lot of times, the foundation isn't something that's really seen. You think of the foundation of your house, right? You know, that's a very important piece. If your foundation starts to get bad, that's bad news for the entire house. And not only that, it's a lot of money to fix. Foundations are not easy or convenient to fix. And a lot of times, you won't see any money back on that renovation project when you fix the foundation of the house. I think the same thing with your car. You've got tires. The foundation of your car, you need tires, right? Car won't run properly. You won't be safe if you have poor tires. But whenever you go to sell the car, you don't get much money back because you have new tires. At least I've never experienced that. But everything in our life has foundations. You think about your relationships, whether you're talking about your spouse, your family, your parents, your mom, or your kids, your siblings. Think about your neighbor, your coworkers. Your coworkers, do you have a foundation of dog-eat-dog world, or you have a foundation of trust and we're trying to help the team survive? That changes how you function. That changes what is produced in that work environment. See, our foundation is crucial. Our foundation is where everything is built upon, and then we can see things that come from that. So after the people built the altar, after they began sacrificing on the altar and celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, just then the people hired masons and carpenters and bought cedar logs from the people of Tyre and Sidon, paying them with food and wine and olive oil. The logs were brought down from the Lebanon mountains and floated along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea to Joppa, for King Cyrus had given permission for this. The construction of the temple of God began in mid-spring during the second year after they arrived in Jerusalem. The workforce was made up of everyone who had returned from exile, including Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and his fellow priests, and the Levites. The Levites, who were 20 years old or older, were put in charge of rebuilding the Lord's temple. The workers at the temple of God were supervised by Jeshua with his sons and relatives, and Kadmiel and his sons, and all descendants of Hodavah. Then they were helped in this task by the Levites and the family of Hednevah. When the builders completed laying the foundation of the Lord's temple, the priests put on their robes, and they took their place to blow their trumpets, and they clashed their cymbals to praise the Lord. With praise and thanks, they sang a song to the Lord. He is so good. His faithful love for Israel endures forever. Then all the people gave a great shout, praising the Lord, for the foundation of the Lord's temple had been laid. But many of the older priests, Levites, and other leaders who had seen the first temple wept aloud when they saw the new temple's foundations. The others, however, were shouting for joy. The joyful shouting and weeping mingled together in a loud noise that could be heard far in the distance. So I've got one more tower I want to build real quick, and got a little bit more construction that I've got to do to put this together. So as God's people are rebuilding their tower, they recognize that they had to buy supplies, they had to get things, they had to get the wood, all the supplies in order to construct the building as it needed to be. And it took time. It took several months for all this to happen. In fact, it was about 7 months from the time that Israel took, when re-enter the promised land to when they started rebuilding the temple. That's how long it took them to actually get things organized and as it should be. God's work takes time. And we have to recognize it's not something that always happens automatically or easily or without any effort. It takes God's people time and effort and energy to make sure that it actually works as it's supposed to. Wait. This one's got a point on it, so. But it took them time to get organized and get things structured as they needed to. And they put people in charge. They made sure that, the Levites were in charge, and there was accountability with that. Being in charge isn't just about prestige. It's not about having your name recognized. There's accountability that is embedded in that leadership. But we come back to our foundation. Remember, you will spiritually fail if your foundation is frail. But they're coming back and they laid the foundation for the altar. They built the altar, and then they began laying the foundation for the temple. There may be times in your life where things just crumble, where things are destroyed. Or there may be times in your life where you say, you know what, I need to go back to the drawing board. I need to start over and get to how it was beforehand. And there's an answer in Scripture for how we should proceed with this. In Psalm chapter 11, verse 3, it says, the foundations of law and order have collapsed. What can the righteous do? Sometimes that happens. Sometimes the foundation is just questionable, and we need to rebuild. So you know what we do? When our foundation has crumbled, when things aren't as they should, rebuild. That's what God calls us to do. For 70 years, God's people had been living in exile in Babylon, and they come back and they began rebuilding. It's hard, it's difficult, and we're going to see how hard and difficult it was for the people throughout the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and this rebuilding process and restoring and all that went into it. It's hard, but God says rebuild. There's no excuse. Start now. It's spiritual revival. When God's people built the altar and were laying the foundation for the temple, they were making spiritual decisions, not financial ones, not military ones, not national ones. They were making spiritual decisions. Because if it's broken, we can fix it in the name of Jesus. I believe that as a foundational truth. If we believe that there's nothing our God can't do, then we can say it can be fixed in the name of Jesus. That is a truth and reality in which we live. But you may have noticed that there were some that were shouting for joy, and there were some that were weeping and mourning. For 70 years, the people had been in exile. So it had been 70 years since that first temple had been destroyed. So those who remember the temple were not spring chickens anymore. They were the older generation. They were the ones who were just passing the torch as much as it could happen. But everybody else was excited, was pumped. We see God working here. We see God doing something special. But the older ones said, it's not as special as it used to be. It's not like it was. Because they remembered the temple. They remembered the majesty of that first temple that Solomon built. And as I was contemplating this, it made me think, man, that speaks to the church, doesn't it? Man, we always long for the glory days, don't we? Man, it's not how it used to be. And you can fill in the blank for anything and everything. But one of the things I really believe about Jesus is that the future can always be better. Now, the past may be great. Jesus may have done awesome things in the past, but the future can get better. I think one of the prime examples in our church is people talk about the Easter dramas, the Easter cantatas, or whatever they were, and how awesome they were. I bet they were. But I believe Jesus can do even better things. Nothing against those things he's done in the past. But if we keep looking at the past, then we're going to be hindered in the future. Because those older priests, those older Levites, those older leaders missed what God was doing in the present because they focused on the past. So to me, that's why it's so important to make sure that our foundation actually produces things. Because one of the problems about this tower, it's hollow. On the outside, it looks impressive. On the outside, man, this is a sturdy tower. This is a tower that's going to take a lot to knock down. But man, when it falls, because it's hollow, it just scatters. So it may take a little bit more to knock down than some of these other towers. But the foundation that it produced didn't produce any meat in the middle. And I fear there are so many people in the church who act like this. And if I'm honest, this is a tower that I would probably resonate with. I grew up in the church. I know how to look sturdy. I know how to look put together. You know, I don't wear a tie anymore, but that's okay, right? But I know how to say it's okay when it isn't. But I also find that this is a pretty inaccessible tower. It's standoffish. It's not one that people are drawn to. It's not one that really people care to look at. It's not a really exciting tower. Now I'm going to come to this tower. Now, so we can see through this tower, right? That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But one of the things I've always been intrigued with this tower is you can pull posts out on this tower. It still stands. It's still there. There's still some posts connected to the foundation. But it gets a little weaker and a little weaker. That doesn't look very strong, does it? But I fear there are so many people like this who they have decided, I'm connected to Jesus. If I'm going to remove one of these posts, it's okay. I'm still connected over here. But our connection to the foundation in Jesus is so flimsy that our tower is going to fall over at a strong wind. And so it falls over, and it crashes, and people say that person didn't really care about Jesus in the first place. And I would say, they say, well, this person didn't really care about Jesus in the first place because they don't care about me. There's nothing in the middle. Now, I'll be honest, this is my favorite tower that I build. So this is going to be the poster child tower, okay? So normally, it would go on this nice little foundation. But one of the things I like about this tower is the fact that the connections to the base are obvious. They're there. It can't survive without these sturdy posts compared to this post. But one of the things, I like it that you can see through the tower, right? Now I know there's no meat in the middle like this one, so bear with me as I go through my analogy here. But I find that to make it accessible. It recognizes that I'm not perfect. It recognizes that people can see my imperfections. You can't see the imperfections over here, but they're there. And over here, you hardly see anything that's associated with Jesus. But this tower is sturdy, right? It can get knocked over. Every tower can get knocked over. And when it gets knocked over, it breaks. You know what Jesus says when the tower breaks? Rebuild. Because Jesus can fix it. But see, when we have this sturdy foundation over here, it should produce something in our life that's sturdy. Not because of me, but because my foundation is in Jesus Christ. And if my foundation is in Jesus Christ, then the rest of my life is founded on that sturdiness. And if I want it to be flimsy, I can. If I want it to be cold and standoffish, I can. If I want it to be strong, if I want it to point to Jesus, if I want it to be something where people are drawn to it because it's something that's cool, it's nice, it's intriguing, then I can. That's what Jesus does for us. He calls us to have the foundation that is strong, but that foundation has to produce things. So I challenge you to evaluate what the foundation is producing in your life. You know, if your foundation is frail, you will spiritually fail. I agree with that. But just because we say our foundation is Jesus doesn't mean it's producing the right stuff. We got to be connected to Jesus. We got to be open. We got to be transparent. We can't allow ourselves to be closed off from others, and we can't allow ourselves to be flaky. We got to find what it means to be strongly connected to Jesus while still producing something that's relevant, something that's good and pleasing. And it's not relevant from a worldly standpoint. It's relative of how can Jesus impact others the way he's impacted me. Because this one doesn't look for that. This one might, but this one hasn't really been impacted by Jesus. So wherever you are, I hope you are celebrating what God is doing. Because it can be real easy for us to have the same temptation that the older priests and Levites did. You know, it's been almost a year since we reopened our facility. And people say, man, I want to get back to normal. Well, there's nothing wrong with what normal used to be. But I believe there's something greater Jesus can do. I believe that there's something greater Jesus is pushing us towards. And I'm not talking about getting rid of things, or that's not my point. But don't look to the past and wish it was the future. We can allow the past to inspire us into the future. But Jesus has called us to put our foundation in Him. When our foundation is in Him and it builds something strong in our life, then whatever the future holds is going to be great because God is a part of it. Have your foundation, but I want to challenge you to critically evaluate what the foundation is producing, because what it's producing will reveal how much you really care about that foundation in the first place.